Welcome to 9wax TV. We're saying farewell to the Porsche 992. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the life and legacy of the 8th generation 911. Welcome to inside the 992. We're up in Northumberland. We're actually on a Cayenne launch with Porsche GB. Thank you so much to the awesome team at Porsche GB for allowing some seat time in a stunning, stellar example of the 992 generation in the Carrera T. I say 992, in a few short weeks this will be known as the 992.1 or 992 Gen 1 because we're about to welcome the 992.2. Usually entails a little bit more than a facelift. There's usually some key technological changes in terms of the engine that powers these wonderful sports cars. So this really is an apt time to look back on the 992.1 as history will now know it. Find out what it's taught us and what it's given us over the 6 years that it's been produced. So it was the 27th of November 2018 that Porsche revealed the 992 generation from, it was the Porsche Experience Centre in Los Angeles. The 8th generation 911, it was billed by CEO Dr. Oliver Bloom as being offering more performance but also more efficiency as well. And headline news was that with this generation, all 911s were wide body, 1,852 millimetres, in case you're wondering. And the 911 didn't just ditch the narrow body, they also, and I think this is sacrilegious, those 5 analogue dials that have been on the 911 for what was at the time 55 years, they were replaced by 2 digital screens either side of this analogue tacho. And yeah, 6 years on, I've still not quite forgiven Porsche for it, I've got to be honest with you. However, Porsche was sympathetic towards 911s of old in the design of the 992. For example, the front wings, they now fully engulf the headlights. That was last seen on the 993 generation of 911, the last air-cooled 911. The bonnet and its leading edge, that was completely flat. That was said to evoke the styling of the G-series, the impact bumper cars of the 70s and 80s. The G-body or impact bumper theme was brought into the cabin as well, referenced this door card design with the forward-facing handle and then flat top of the door bins as well. Porsche also revived the 1980s 911 script for the deck lid as well. So history brought forward into the 992. Porsche though was also looking to the future with the 992, and that's why the flat 6 turbocharged engine were not only more powerful, but it's also more efficient as well. The big thing and really interesting point to note was with the transmission, and it could become ever more significant as we introduced the 992.2 because there was space left within the gearbox housing for hybridisation. Porsche saying at the time they had future-proofed the 911 in 992 form. So that's the setup of the 992 design and spec. In terms of production, well, it's been interesting, hasn't it? According to my numbers, and I've studied this in detail, so I haven't just plucked this out of thin air, I think there are around 175,000 992, so that's around the same number as 996 is. Obviously there have been some global difficulties, we shall say, during the life of this car that has absolutely affected its production numbers. And that has contributed to what has been quite an interesting early history. After the first year of production, we went into a global pandemic. Porsche closing the production line at Zuffenhausen for the first time in the 911's history. That means that there was a shortage of 992s, and actually that had a significant impact in terms of values on the second-hand market, and Carrera S's and 4S's and everything else, because there were so few made and demand was high. Some of those models was actually an overs market for them, which is kind of mad when you think about it now. Of course, after the pandemic, even up to modern day, all manufacturers have faced challenges logistically and in terms of availability and deliverance of parts. That has affected the 992, there's no question that. It has meant that some of you, for example, ordering cars with ceramics, well, ceramics haven't been available. Other certain spec points have had to be retrofitted at dealers after delivery. So that's been quite interesting. It was a 911 generation that was quite scarce in terms of numbers to begin with because of that pandemic, but it's then since recovered and it's almost gone a little bit the other way. There are so many models, such as Turbo S's, that it's left to quite a significant price correction. That's been a really good example, a marker of where values have gone. First, there were very few Turbo S's. They were launched before the Turbo, actually, bizarrely, a bit like the Carrera S was launched before the Carrera. And again, because of when it was released in the height of the pandemic, there were very few Turbo S's around at the time, and it led to this big push on inflated prices, and an overs market developed. At its height, there were Turbo S's trading for £250,000, which I don't want to get too political in this video, but that was ludicrous and frankly was not sustainable. To be honest, we called it out on 9works TV. You may or may not know, following this channel, we do a quarterly review where we speak with trusted specialists from around the marketplace, and it was Jonathan Franklin from Jonathan Franklin Cars who said that will not last. And sure enough, here we are at the start of 2024, and there's been a significant price correction for those cars and others within the lineup. And it leads us to where we are today. I think the other real highlight of the 992 generation has been the expansion of the model lineup in terms of pushing the envelope of possibilities and capabilities of the Porsche 911. Now, I'm going to do a separate video on this. The extremes of this are the Dakar, which took the 911, production 911, off-roading for the first time, and also the GT3 RS, which really, really, really is a cup car with license plates. So it's pushed the breadth of capabilities of the 911 to new extremes while still remaining true to the values of the quintessential 9 Alpha. That's been a real highlight. In terms of like model highlights, my favourite of the generation, I think high commendation for the Sport Classic. What is that? Well, it's basically everything the 911 Turbo isn't these days. So obviously it is turbocharged, but rear wheel drive and manual. That really is a superb car, and I think will go down in history as one of the better 992s. The 992 really has perfected a couple of things on the 911. The first being the steering, okay? You may remember back in 2011 when the 991 generation was launched, that's the 7th generation of 911, Porsche introduced electrically assisted steering rather than hydraulically. It's chiefly because it's weight saving and more efficient. The criticism of that at the time was that the electrically assisted system lacked feel, and it did. The hydraulic systems of the 997 and before were, in my opinion, better. GT cars did improve the recipe, and over the life, or the 8 years of the 991 generation, the steering did improve, but it wasn't until, in my opinion anyway, the introduction of this car, the 992, that Porsche had really perfected the electrically assisted system in terms of feel, in terms of weight, helped, of course, by the fact this is wider at the front, which leads to much more composed, flatter cornering. It all just feeds into a wonderful front axle, which was pushed even further with the double wishbone setup on the GT cars. The other thing is this little stick, the manual gearbox. So again, with the 991 generation, Porsche introduced an extra cog to the stick shift. So we were now rocking 7-speed manuals. And in my opinion, it was a bit of a mess. Easy to get lost in there. There was too many ratios. It was getting like Fast and Furious, rowing through the gates all the time. But also, the quality of the shift wasn't great. It was quite clunky. More so on the all-wheel drive 911s over the rear drive, but a bit messy, a bit of an awkward spring loading. I've said this before. For example, when you're popping out a 7th, which is an overdrive really, say you're coming off the motorway on a slip road, you want to go from 7th to 5th, you'd find 3rd a bit too easily or by accident. Any case, for the 992 generation, the 7-speed remained, but it's clearly had a lot of reworking. That clunkiness is now gone, the awkwardness all but eradicated as well, and it's just a really nice, fluid, lightweight shift without being too lightweight as to feel superfluously so. Beautiful. I said this on my manual review at the time because you may remember that the manual wasn't available for the first year of 911 production, and even then it was only available on the Carrera S and GTS. The base Carrera robbed of the manual. Porsche said that was for emissions. I think we all know that was because the Carrera T was coming. And Porsche wanted to protect sales of the base car. But anyway, any case, as I said on my review of the 7-speed 992 manual at the time, I would say that after 8 years of trying, Porsche finally perfected the 7-speed stick shift in its 911. And this transmission really is a delight. In the Carrera T and also the GTS, in fact, the shifter itself is shorter, stubbier. It's a nice kind of short throw through the gate. And again, it's quite light, so it gives you all of that without robbing you of that mechanical feel, which is so crucial for us in driving these sports cars. So those two factors, as I said, represent big wins for the 992, and they are evident and resplendent in the Carrera T, a car that's fun on UK roads, not super stiff. I know the touring has come in for some criticism, 992 GT3 touring, for being a bit too stiff on UK roads. The reality is a lot of the particularly heavier 992 generation cars, they do struggle a little bit in the UK. Our roads in this country are absolutely terrible. It would be nice to see going forward a C16, that's a UK spec chassis or suspension setup for the 911, just to deal with that a bit better. Although the GT3 RS, a phenomenal car by anyone's standards, that is evidence that Porsche is improving the damping there, because I actually think that car is better damped for UK roads and rides better on the road in the UK than the GT3 Touring. It's a real work of art, that. So there have clearly been successes with the 992 story. There have been some observations that aren't so positive. I myself, the design hasn't won me over, particularly at the rear of the car. I think the gap basically between the license plate recess and the lights is too big. It's an awkward gap. The Sport Design Pack solves that, of course it does. The other thing is, proportionally, it's getting bigger and bigger. I think that takes away from the sports car experience. I've said before, you're driving down narrow country roads that we have in the UK. Sometimes as a driver, you're quite literally breathing in, passing oncoming traffic. I do appreciate, though, these cars really are designed for the American market, which sells a lot more in volume than here in the UK. And you guys over in America have got massive roads. Other things I don't like, in fact I really dislike about the 992, the door handles. They're horrible, they're clunky, very unelegant. I don't understand what was wrong with the door handles on the previous generation. The answer, by the way, is nothing. There was absolutely nothing wrong with them. Other observations elsewhere, the creeping digitisation takes away from the traditional 911 experience. That brings us on to the legacy of the 992. What legacy will it leave behind? Well, I think overall it's only going to get rosier for the 992 from this point. I think as the 911 going forward introduces hybridisation, maybe even e-mobility, further digitisation. All right, these cars are turbocharged, but they're still powered solely, exclusively by an internal combustion engine. The legendary flat six at that. And I think going forward, that's going to mean a lot to enthusiasts. So to summarise, an interesting and action-packed few years of production of that, there absolutely is no doubt. I think it's a generation of 911 that will only be thought of with more and more fondness as under the march of time. Technological wins, the steering, the seating position, and the gearbox, manual gearbox feel, all utterly perfected for the modern world, in my view. Things I'd like to see improved. Please, Porsche, get rid of the horrible handles and just fill in those gaps that I think are missing at the rear. And I think this could be an interesting footnote as well. I'm predicting a rosy future generally for the 992 generation, particularly if you think in 20 years' time where we're going to be. I think that's only good news for the 991 generation before as well, because I think in particular reference to the 991.2, it's a beautiful design, a beautiful 911, more so than the 992. But also it does give you a lot of what the 992 is all about, without too much digitisation. For example, it gives you the iconic 5 clocks. It's a brilliant multi-purpose tool for everything from daily driving to cross-continental road trips to track days. And there are narrow body cars as well. So that's it then from me and the 992. Thank you again to the Porsche GB for giving me this fabulous opportunity. It's never lost on me. and I'm eternally grateful, so thank you for some seat time. Thanks for watching. What are your observations on the 992? Let's have a conversation on that. Until next time, thank you for joining us on 9Weights TV.